The Plain Truth, a show where we like to go into some of the mysteries and anomalies and dirty financial underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Plain, and joining us this week is Catherine Austin Fitz, who really needs no introduction. She's quite well known in the alternative world out there. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, thank you for having me. And I apologize, I have a hoarse voice, but I'm really very fine.
Well, we appreciate you coming and fighting through the cold or whatever. And along for the ride, we have a few of my friends. We have Oolong Rabbit. Oolong, are you there?
I'm here. Hello, Catherine.
Hi.
Green Meadow.
Hello.
Hi, Green Meadow.
And Gigi.
Hi, Catherine. Welcome.
Hey, Gigi.
So, I guess it's that time of year where we might want to start with just the, what can I say, the general idea is, what are the highlights and the lowlights of last year? What went down in 2013 that is worth contemplating?
Oh, I think there was a great deal. To me, the highlight of the year was that gun control failed. And if you look at all the horsepower behind it, that failure was quite a stunning defeat for the administration. And what it does is it shows that there is an incredible and very deep intelligence throughout America about what's really going on. You know, every time you think that people don't know, something like that happens, and it proves they do know, and they're going to stand their ground. So I think that was a very, to me, that was one of the great, very positive stories of 2013. The other story that I think is very important for most people to understand is that with the Fed continuing to do quantitative easing, something has happened, and that is that between the bailouts and the extraordinary quantitative easing, they have managed to basically buy up and extinguish all the financial fraud that was used to finance what I call the coup d'etat. And the combination of extinguishing the criminal liabilities and sort of shredding the fraudulent paper, plus the statute of limitations going by, as well as the Department of Justice continuing to make all sorts of settlements with the financial institutions, means essentially that phase is over, and we're now proceeding into a new phase. And I just finished publishing our annual wrap-up for the Solari Report, and I talked about the extraordinary movement of money out of the old industrial model. I called it Global 2.0 into Global 3.0, and I think what we're now beginning to see is the money that was shifted out of government and households in an extraordinary process in the developed world is now beginning to be reinvested in a variety of very new applications. And what that's going to do is it's going to accelerate change. So I think 2013 will turn out to be a very pivot year when it comes to finishing off the financial coup and then shifting into the next phase.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a good thing that gun control was stopped pretty cold. And a lot of those events, by the way, looked very suspicious. I mean, actors all over the place, and, just really when you look into them, you have to wonder whether they weren't just drills in half the cases or something. But,
it wasn't in 2013, but the Dark Knight Massacre was an interesting phenomena because the takeaway of the general population is we need guns. And so it boomeranged. What you were seeing is all of these sort of covert ops had started to boomerang, and people were too smart. They finally had reached the point where they could fathom that these things are covert operations. And so I think the Dark Knight, operation boomeranged. And people started to think, to go the other way. And it's one of the reasons that Newtown was probably such a brutal event, but it didn't do the trick. And what the reason I think it was so astonishing, Plain, that gun control didn't happen, is it was clear to me that the Democrats had promised that as part of the condition to being able to win the election. So this was a major promise made to, a wide variety of the most powerful private investment interests in the world, is my read. And so this was one they had to deliver. They had made a promise and they had to deliver it. And they threw every possible, they used every trick, they pulled every, political chit they had, and they couldn't get it done. And I think that, the way it went down, I think, was as inspiring as the fact that it went down.
Well, I'm outside the States, so I'm not totally up on, the news cycle, which seems to be so, I don't know, fear-driven and excitement-driven. But I am familiar with Portland, Oregon, because I lived there for a number of years. And there was an event there that took place perhaps in a suburb, maybe Beaverton, where there was somebody who was going to gun people down, and an off-duty security guard pulled out a gun and stopped it. And I think that was an event they wanted to hype, but they had to go into panic mode, essentially, and try to cover that up. Because that made the argument that the answer to crazy people with guns is good people with guns.
Right.
And that's exactly what they didn't want to hear. So for sure, that's a big deal in the last year that they made such promises. What about on the more international stage? I thought the big thing internationally was the U.S. Essentially, or NATO, backed down in the Middle East and maybe kind of retreating and pivoting to Asia. What is your take?
Well, I think the American military is tired. It's very overextended. It's tired. It's under a lot of stress, and with defense budget cuts coming, there's between the military being tired and the creditors being tired and the American people being tired, for the administration to try and build support for an incursion into Syria or more aggression in and around Iran was just, the whole effort was too exhausting. I just saw an estimate that Iraq to date has cost us $2.2 trillion, and of course, what do we have to show for that other than we kept the oil price high? So I think there's a great deal of exhaustion, number one, and the decision to pivot to Asia is understanding that we have at this point more strategic interests, or the America has more strategic interests in remaining the hegemon. So, but there's no doubt that the United States is very spread thin, because on one hand you have to basically control the sea lanes and the satellite lanes to remain the reserve currency, and the reserve currency, brings many financial benefits with it. The problem is, what does it cost you to maintain that military presence globally? So you're watching the military spread very thin in an environment where the stress is on them tremendously.
Well, now we get into a topic that you've brought up many times, and it's a key one, and that is the question of sea lanes. And where does that stand? I mean, it's obvious that, and Brzezinski wrote his book on the Grand Chessboard, that Central Asia is really a key element of everything, from, let's say, Turkey or at least Iran over to China and down to Korea. And there's this tremendous push for heavy rail, pipelines, freeways, all kinds of things. And of course, the shipping time from China is going to go from 44 days down to, 8 days to get to wherever, right. Berlin or something.
Right.
And so China, and for that matter, Russia, all of these countries, their dependence on the sea lanes is going to drop dramatically.
Right.
And how do you see that playing out?
Well, the dependence on the sea lane has been dropping steadily, and the importance of the satellite lanes have been rising steadily. But, the way to think about it, so I absolutely agree with you that a lot more is going to be done through Eurasia over land. But I said to somebody the other day when we were working on the wrap-up, I said, 2014 is the year everybody's going to realize that hardware controls. And what I meant by that was whether it's the internet cables running under the ocean or the satellite systems, roaming overhead, or the pipeline running through Eurasia, the guy who controls is the guy who controls the hardware that the train tracks run over. And is that making any sense?
Sure.
Okay.
But I mean, it does beg the question. I mean, if something's going from Russia to China, I mean, I don't think the U.S. satellites are going to be running it, whatever systems they have.
No. I agree with you. And what we're watching, as we've seen the U.S. try and extend their reach globally, what we're watching is countries around the world do everything they can to slip out of that reach. So, the way I describe it is you have the G7 who are in the central banking warfare model, and they're trying to get everybody into that model, and they're using carrot and sticks to do it. And what we saw in 2010 to 2012, is the BRIC nations who are part of G20 but not part of G7 start to really flex their muscles. And what happened in 2013 was essentially G7 called the capital home. One, because they needed it, but two, they were tired of financing guys who were stretching their muscles. They called that capital home, and if anything, it made everybody sort of more recalcitrant. So you're watching countries all around the world. So Brazil is saying, we want our own internet. Part of this is going to be the balkanization of the internet in response to kind of an appreciation of how important those train tracks are to the financial payment system as more and more people get on smartphones and more money starts flying over the internet. So on one hand, you're watching countries around the world saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be part of a centralized model, and the G7 pushing harder to exercise centralization. So you basically got a flow between the forces of centralization and the forces of decentralization. And as you know, I'm a great proponent of the forces of decentralization. But I've had quite an education in how the forces of centralization succeed. So this is really a battle royale, and we watched it unfold throughout 2013, and I suspect we're going to continue to watch it unfold in 2014. G7 has said it's going to target the tax havens, and of course we got a little taste of that with what happened on Cyprus in the spring of 2013. And they've certainly been sort of locking down Switzerland. If you're going to target the tax havens, you kind of have to lock down Switzerland first. That's done. And so if they proceed to act against the tax havens through 2014, we're going to see, that battle royale go to a whole new pitch.
What do you mean by the balkanization of the internet?
Well, what countries around the world are beginning to realize is that if you are operating over a platform, whether it's the cables or the telecommunications infrastructure or the cell infrastructure, or you're in the cloud of an American company, that your data may not be secure, that you may be accessible to the NSA platform. And if you believe what I believe, then the data about your financial transactions are being accessed and used in terms of economic warfare against you. And so it's putting you at an enormous disadvantage because the folks you're competing with are have access to your private information and are translating that into the ability to get business, do deals, take advantage in a way that essentially harvests you. And so that means it's worth your while to go out and build the cables and build the satellite systems and build the telecommunications infrastructure so that you can basically put up a wall where the foreign intelligence agencies can't get in.
Yeah, that makes
so,
a lot of sense.
Yeah, so we've just seen, America's, yes, we have, the Americans have a military which has been dominant, but one of the Americans' greatest advantages in terms of economic warfare is starting in the 80s, they started to build out what I call the data beast, and, have used computing power and artificial intelligence to access enormous data that can be translated into economic action, at the deal level. Is the ultimate in insider trading systems. And so, and I think it's hard for many people to fathom how powerful that machinery was and how profitable. And the Snowden revelations are now making it clear. I'll give you an example. Pier 1, which is a Canadian company that does cloud hosting in the United States, the UK, and Canada, just did a survey of 300 companies. 25% said they were planning on moving their data out of the U.S. cloud.
That's
and that's
significant.
because they don't trust the American companies. In fact, you've seen Silicon Valley very much in Congress lobbying to roll back certain provisions in the Patriot Act because they're losing business significantly. Once the revelations came out, if you're a company with, pieces of your infrastructure in a cloud company, that's American headquartered, it takes you a long time to kind of move your operations. But get ready over the next year or two for a massive withdrawal of companies into non-U.S. companies that offer, higher levels of security, encryption, other forms of privacy. The war is now on in the telecommunications company to offer privacy.
Go ahead.
Was Snowden, do you think, was he part of an information war to actually take down the U.S., or was he actually someone to inform the U.S. people of what was going on?
Well, here's the thing. It's inconceivable to me that Snowden, if you look at Snowden, who he was, what his story was, my guess on Snowden is he's had a lot of powerful air cover. And, I assume he's a sincere young person, but I think he's had tremendous air cover. And so the question is, who's protecting him and why? Because no one gets that much air cover or that much promotion without some kind of significant help and support. So then, of course, the question is, what factions are helping him? One of the things you're watching is we just saw the President of the United States, he appointed a commission to study all of this, make recommendations. The recommendations they're making are to basically, cut the NSA out and leave the data with the telcos and the third-party providers, which I assure you is far more dangerous. I call it friendly fascism 3.0, and I talk about it in the wrap-up. You're basically saying, okay, we're going to give the private guys the control position. They're not overseen by Congress. They're not subject to the same rules and regulations. They're not subject to FOIA. So it wouldn't surprise me if one of the impetuses behind this is the private guys saying, okay, well, now that the U.S. government has financed our building out the data beast, let's kind of cut their legs out from under them and make sure we have control. There's a great Italian movie called The Listening about the NSA and how the contractors take over, and it's very much shades of that. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a great, it's a great description. It's why I always say fact is fiction and fiction is fact, but it's one of those fictional representations of this whole situation, which is very, very good. Another one, if you haven't seen it, is Enemy of the State. Wonderful. Yeah, wonderful movie. But The Listening describes sort of the contractors taking over, and that's what we've seen in the U.S. government. In what I watched from 1989 until I left in 98, and certainly I've been in touch since, is all these agencies are basically run by government contractors, and the bureaucracy no longer controls whatsoever, and the political appointees certainly control. They cycle in and out. But when I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, the largest contractor at HUD at the time was Lockheed Martin. They ran all the information systems and payment systems. I think they had a $180 million a year contract, which in 1989 was a great deal of money. And, and I would ask them both when I was Assistant Secretary and when I went back in as lead financial advisor, I would ask them for basic data on basic programs. They would refuse to give it to me. And I couldn't make them give it to they were in control. So, and if you messed with them...
So who's in control of the
NSA?
NSA?
Had a problem. What?
So who is in control of the NSA?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't, I haven't made it my effort to dig in and try and get a description of all the different contracts, but my guess is you have a lot of the big defense contractors and telecommunications companies in there running things. I mean, I'll give you an example. The last time I looked at the smart meter effort, you had IBM as the lead contractor on the census, which was very invasive. And then they were also the lead contractor on smart meter software. I'm sorry, not contractor, just provider on smart meter software. And then they were they're a big contractor at Department of Defense and a lot of different relevant agencies. And if you look at both what they're doing on the census and what they're doing on smart meters, and then what they're doing for a variety of different agencies, it's pretty scary because I don't know if you've ever read the story of IBM and the Holocaust.
Yes.
The Holocaust worked because IBM was running the databases, and it was the database operation that really made the Holocaust sing. And they're the same people who are putting together essentially a database of every American in their home. Now, the federal government already has that. I'll give you another example. When Enron happened, you had as chairman of the Enron Finance Committee on their board a gentleman who was also the lead investor and once chairman, and then when he sold part of his position, then he was chairman of the compensation committee of a company called DynCorp. DynCorp was the lead information services system provider to enforcement at the SEC and also lead IT contractor at the Department of Justice, including running the systems that oversaw promise in the litigation division. And the Department of Justice kept saying that it hadn't asserted control over the documentation of Enron. So I would say on the radio shows, well, wait a minute, the guys who run Enron have asserted document control over the SEC enforcement and the Department of Justice enforcement, who are supposed to be enforcing against Enron. So, yeah, you have in the United States a government that no longer has information sovereignty or financial sovereignty. So the on one hand, financially, you are completely dependent on the New York Fed member banks to finance you, which is why we're watching the New York Fed member banks act with such impunity. And you are totally dependent on all the top defense contractors to run your IT and payment systems. So you don't have information sovereignty and you don't have financial sovereignty, which means it's really not a government. What it is it's a budget, and it's a pot of money, it's a flow of money, but it is controlled by those who run it operationally.
Well, to me, being originally from D.C. and, having, the family and friends and experiences that come from that, I tend to see it as D.C. and the whole federal government system in the U.S. has become kind of more of a machine in a way than it was, let's say, 50 years ago or 40 years ago or something. It's more and more these interlocking relationships that are business, like you're saying, who controls the computers now is so powerful relative to the past.
Right.
And I even see this in things like Snowden or possibly Bitcoin, other things playing out where there are, how can we put it? There may be a fight with high-tech types trying to gain power over banker types, and maybe we're moving into that era where technocracy means technical control, and
Right.
whoever has the systems is really in charge. And this is different from what we saw 50 or 100 years ago, where, you know, uh, rich bankers from Europe could just buy the assassins they needed or whatever it was they needed, because the harsh reality is the NSA not only has the ability to deliver force, it has the ability to protect itself.
Right. Have you read the book The Master Switch?
No.
It's quite interesting, and it basically puts forward the similar thesis, which is, we build this wonderful information. It goes throughout history as the sort of information technology improves. We build this wonderful technology. There's a burst of innovation, and then it consolidates under the control of, a small hand of players who sort of abuse the centralization. And, then they get busted up, and it happens again. And, it keeps centralizing into a few and then busting up. And they call it the master switch. And it's quite interesting and very well done.
Have to look into that. But I tell you what, let's get back to the idea of anything else in 2013 that seemed of note to you, and then we'll move into 2014.
I think another thing of note is what's been happening in energy. You're watching a real effort globally to begin to build out renewable energy, as well as have conversations about breakthrough energy. And I think we're moving towards a more resilient model. At the same time, you're seeing, first in North America and now moving to Europe, the use of new fracking technology, of course, very controversial, to significantly expand self-sufficiency within those areas in energy. And one of the things that I think is shifting the politics of the Middle East is the extraordinary improvement in the North American energy picture. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's why you're starting to see the UK and Europe move to begin to do fracking. So I think that's having an impact. We see utilities really suffering economically because the more the renewable energy grows, the more they're struggling to sort of cover their overhead. So all of this creative destruction has put the utilities in a difficult position. And we see that throughout the economy. It's one of the things I talk in the wrap-up. As the money shifts out of sort of industrial model 2.0 and these much higher overhead organizations into the more network 3.0, you're seeing the 2.0 models really struggle. And, of course, the 3.0s are having fun and sort of having a party. And, two very different kinds of economies living side by side as one kind of fades away and the other comes roaring up.
Well, that raises a couple of questions. I'm outside the U.S. and usually get a non-U.S. perspective. And overwhelmingly, the people I talk to or information I read is very skeptical of the whole fracking, revolution. Just a couple days ago, I talked to a J.P. Morgan guy here in Tokyo, and he's from Britain originally, but he just thought that the depletion rates or the different aspects of that will make it so that it's more of a short-term play until some of these other energy technologies can come online.
Oh, I agree. I think that's right.
In other words, in 5 years, I mean, it's hyped quite a bit, but I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are, but
well, here's why it's hyped quite a bit, and I agree with him. I think this is a short-term. It's an interim step. If you were to conjecture as to what would be happening to the dollar and the U.S. economy if it wasn't happening as an interim step, I think it's the comparison of what would have happened without it versus what's happening now that makes it, such a important thing. But I agree with him. It's far from, it simply pushes the day that you have to switch to other sources.
Oh, by the way, speaking of the alternative energy, on this show we interviewed Mark Dancy. Do you know who he is?
Yes, wonderful guy.
Yes. And essentially, his take was that there's tremendous excitement, energy, and action in the energy field, but it's just not in what you would call free energy. And what can I say? His examples seem quite numerous. I mean, all throughout Asia, uh, great improvements are taking place, and
Right.
even in his home country of Australia,
Right.
tremendous improvements in the sense of even just solar uh, takes away the power from the utility companies.
Right.
And so there seems to be this great movement, but it's like the U.S. is the most lagging in his view. It's like there's been an evil corporate takeover, I think, is more or less what he was saying. And so the reason that's relevant is when we talk about a global 2.0 economy or a global 3.0 economy, I'm just concerned that living here in Asia, traveling around Asia a lot, I see some of the future a lot more in Asia, including, by the way, in China, where it's just a tremendous push for things like thorium and all kinds of other things.
Right.
And then when I visit the U.S., I don't see it as much as maybe you do. I don't see the new movement, I guess, as much.
Well, I think in Asia you have a far more dynamic economy, a far more dynamic culture, and a lot more innovation on an open basis. The United States is very much on lockdown, and a lot of the innovation is in pockets or secret. So I agree with you. You can feel the innovation when I used to live in Hong Kong, and every time I'm there, you walk down the street and you can feel it. So I very much agree with you on that. But I think there's a lot going on in the U.S. It's just going on a secret basis. But right now, the United States is a very, I think in a lot of ways, a very unappetizing place to be, because you've promised the sun, the moon, and the stars to a generation of boomers. Now you've stolen their money, and now you're trying to kind of, grind down the grief and disappointment and keep control as you do it. So it's a very ugly picture.
Well, I see a related thing is the promotion of zombieism. When I visit the U.S., I feel like the people are doped up. A lot of people are on these strange drugs, and I don't know about what's in the water or other things, but I see clearer eyes. Let's just put it that way. Traveling to a place like Malaysia, I see people with clear eyes. And I
Right.
see a lot of people who don't have clear eyes in the U.S., and so I think that affects your thinking as well.
Well, I don't know. What I would say is that the U.S. is bombarded with a huge amount of what I would call electromagnetic poisoning, and I think it's far more intensive here than it is in other places. So the entrainment technology, the propaganda, but the United States is a very violent country, and I think that that it's not commonly understood how dangerous it is to live here and speak the truth and act like you're a free person. So people here are afraid, and but they also know that their most effective strategy is to pretend that everything's fine. It's funny that one of my favorite movies, La Femme Nikita, there's a great scene where Nikita, who's acting as an assassin, is on a covert operation, and everything goes wrong, and so they have to call in what's called a cleaner. And of course, when the cleaner comes in, the easiest thing for the cleaner is just kill everybody, so that there can be no danger of anything getting out. But so it's always important if you have to call in the cleaner that you do everything you can to get along the cleaner so you don't get offed. Anyway, so the cleaner, the woman who's with Nikita kind of freaks out, so the cleaner kills her, turns to Nikita, and she looks at me and she says, "How can I help?" And it's like one of the most chipper smiles you ever want to see. And all across, I call it the Victor the Cleaner smile, and all across America, particularly, sort of on the financial shows, if you look, everybody's got the Victor the Cleaner smile. It's like turbo chipper. And I think that is what happens when you live in a society that is got some very deep-seated fear and is experiencing the growth of what I call friendly fascism.
Well, I got the view that the friendly was just a kind of a put on. It's just an act.
Well, here's the thing: if you look at how the Nazis operated, I mean, the Nazis rounded people up, put them in concentration camps, and gassed them. Here, what you do is you bring drugs and guns into their community. You entice their young people to start dealing the drugs. Then you round them up. You put them in a prison, which does, makes uniforms for the, for the Department of Defense. And you have programs that make it look like you're trying to, rehabilitate them or, help them get high school degrees and do all sorts of things like that. And in the process, you create, high-paid jobs for various people to work at the prison and work in the judicial system. And basically, you've got courts and judicial systems and jails in every community that are, the equivalent of friendly fascist concentration camps. They're just rounding people up and processing them into slave labor camp. But it's all being done and made to look like the people are breaking laws and being bad. And, there's a certain kind of patina to it that the Nazis didn't bother with. And that's what I mean when I say it's friendly, because, if you behave and if you toe the line, then you won't get rounded up.
Catherine, don't you think that runs into John Rappaport's work that you speak to and I also follow on The Matrix, on what's happening in the United States? It's a perfect segue to that conversation.
But, I'm going to be the bad guy and I always get to be the bad guy. This kind of stuff has been going on for decades.
I wouldn't disagree, right?
I don't know. I grew up in a poor neighborhood, and I watched all of this stuff go on in the 50s and 60s. And, there were just a lot more places in the middle class where you didn't have to deal with this stuff. But it was going on in America, and it's the problem is if you don't stop it, when it goes on in the black neighborhoods, eventually it's going to grow. It's like a virus. It's like a cancer, and it's going to grow. And if you see what's being done in the prisons and the jails now, that's going to grow and keep going until we face this. And it's funny, when you talk about leaving the United States, at various times, I've considered leaving the United States, and I realized, my family, if you look back over 500 years, my family's been running away from this for 500 years. And I've just decided, no, I'm not going to run away. I'm just going to turn and march right into the center and try and figure out what in the world's going on.
So how do you think we get that message out to America? Because America just is feeling so dumbed down. I agree with all your comments, and it's just frustrating to watch.
Well, here's the thing. You can't leave something unless you know where you want to go. I said that our poster for 2014 is breakaway. And I think if you're going to break away, you need to know what you're for. And that's why I believe, because I believe ultimately what's going on in this planet is spiritual warfare.
Absolutely.
I think the real war is spiritual, and that's where the battle has to be fought. You have to deal with it first and foremost there before you can deal with anything in the material world. And I also think, you have to bring transparency to things, because evil, does well when it's secret. It does well in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'm going to be part of in 2014 that I'm very much looking forward to is doing what I can to bring illumination to where the money's been going in the black budget, because I think part of part of what's going on in North America is you have a leadership who's dealing with a variety of risks that we don't understand. And that's part of what is causing them to behave the way they're behaving. And so I think we really need to look at the black budget, where the money is going, why it's going there, and what that is all about. Richard Dolan has a new book coming out, which I've had the opportunity to read the copy, and it's absolutely fantastic. I think it's one of the best books in the whole UFO question I've ever seen, but certainly positioned to help a mainstream audience kind of come to grips with this and the impact it's having throughout our society and life. So it's one of the things I'm very hopeful about. But I think first and foremost, what we need is a shift in spiritual consciousness, because you can't solve this without saying, well, how could we exist and function on this planet? And a new model to replace the central banking warfare model is going to need to function and develop in a much higher mind than the central banking warfare model.
You know, Catherine, recently I read a speech from Lord Macaulay in the British Parliament in, 1832 or something. But he spent a lot of time traveling around India, and he just said, look, this place, everyone's happy. There are no beggars. You know, it's much, much worse in Britain. So the only way we can control here is to destroy their culture. We have to make them think, and we have to particularly ruin their educational system so that we can dominate them.
Right.
And I think that's part of that central banking warfare model.
Right.
And so people don't realize how ugly it is. It's not just like, you put some boats offshore and then you make them use the dollar. It's really ugly what's going on in Libya. I mean, probably hundreds of thousands have died and 30% of the country's fled the country.
I was watching Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States earlier this week, and he was describing the 27 million Russians killed during World War II. And I think he counted 65 million people killed during the World War II and on in the 20th century. I think the number is greater than that, but this is an exceptionally violent planet, and the culture is very, very dependent on war. And there is a tremendous desire to control centrally. And the question is why? Where is that coming from?
Yeah, and then for me, another question is, can't you just make the argument that this is the broader decline of the West, and in particular the decline of the Anglo-American, empire? And they've been so abusive for so long. They're panicked at that idea, and so some of what may seem planned, I'm not sure if it's all planned. You can at least make the argument that civilizations come and they go,
right.
And I mean, I guess we get into this question of the slow burn and some of your thinking, but I mean, we're kind of getting to the question of, those whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad, and I see a lot of madness in the U.S. these days. Is it rational planning or is it madness? I mean, and I don't know, but why don't we get into the slow burn question? That happened in 2013, right?
Right. It's happened every year since I started to talk about it, which was about 2001. And the reason I started to use the expression slow burn was I was working and communicating with so many people who were absolutely convinced that collapse, we were going to see a major financial collapse or an economic collapse. And I was trying to explain to them why I thought that was improbable. And the slow burn was basically my description of how it's part of engineering a financial coup d'etat and control, whereby we were going through a process of shifting enormous capital out of the developed world's governments and households and basically privatizing, basically taking it down a rabbit hole of private investment. My estimate is we stole $40 trillion and shifted it out of the existing legal systems in which it was present, and shifted it into private investors' hands for reinvestment in many different places globally, as well as in North America and Europe. But in the process, what we've done is we have, as we left those systems with more liabilities than assets, we've gone through a process of steady debasement of the currencies to sort of grind out that, to reconcile the assets to the liabilities. And it's part of squeezing the broad middle class throughout the developed world. And so I call it the slow burn, because most people are experiencing a steady diminution of income and a steady rising of expenses. And anyway, and so it's a very controlled, centrally controlled economic model, the slow burn. And what never ceases to amaze me is how many of the folks in the financial blogosphere are convinced that collapse is around the corner. And I think part of the reason is that they don't understand the extent of the control mechanisms, and that's one reason to say thank you to Mr. Snowden, because I think he really provided some education on that front.
On that note, Catherine, I don't know if you heard this interview. I think it might have been on USA Watchdog with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. And I think the question was put to him, why hasn't this collapse happened yet that everyone's been predicting? And he has basically come to the conclusion that the Fed and the central planners have basically figured out a way to rig everything.
Well, they can't rig everything. If they could rig everything, we'd have gun control. And I assure you, if we had gun control, we'd have far more fiscal resolution of the matter than debasement resolution of the matter. But until you get the guns in, it's very difficult to make the cuts you need to on the fiscal side. So I don't think they have complete control, but I do think with new technology and globalization, you can continually offset, monetary inflation with labor deflation. And that's what we've been able to do. And we're going to see a new round of automation in the next 2 years, which is unbelievably extraordinary. I think there are very few people who begin to understand what's about the wave that is now rolling upon us in terms of automation. And that's going to kick off round after round of labor deflation globally.
So what about the theories that China and or Russia could potentially throw some type of wrench into the gears? Do you see anything like that happening? I guess,
The only way I see China throwing a wrench into the gears is if China really were to economically collapse, which I think is unlikely. But I think the big danger in 2013 was if China stopped growing and really went into a severe recession, it was going to be a big global problem.
So
I think that was the big fears of China not making it. I think that's one of the reasons you saw a little bit of the West relenting on the oil price, because they had China in too much of a problem. So
it's almost like a symbiotic type self-destructive relationship, I guess. I don't.
Well, here, in a nutshell, what you had was you had China buying securities in the West, and the West using it to provide people with government subsidies, who then went to the stores and bought things from China. And China earned money, which gave them more money to invest in the securities, and round we go. And that solved China's problem. China has a very big problem, and that is, how do you keep that many people employed? I mean, that is a very big problem, and as this new round of automation hits, the only way they can keep people employed is if they really start to allow middle-class growth and consumption. And so I think a decision has been made globally to encourage that.
What about the stance between the West and Russia? It seems like there's been a couple games of chicken that were being played over the last year and a half.
Right. Here's what I think. The Russia and China do not want to be, if the central banking warfare model, if the European and American central banks, if the G7 central banks can get everybody into that model, then they're going to move to a digital currency. I mean, that's going to happen anyway because so many people are getting on the internet. We've just had an explosion of connections through the smartphones and the tablets. And so the push is on as the financial system moves onto that platform to really move to the digital currencies, and that's what all this big fight is about. Who's going to control that, and who's going to be the reserve currency on the internet platforms? So I think, on one hand, Russia and China don't want to be controlled by the G7 in the central banking warfare model. At the same time, there's an awful lot of cooperation behind the scenes between them because they depend on cash flows. At one point in 2005, I had one of Putin advisors try and basically recruit me. And at the time, I thought, what is this about? And I went back and took a look and discovered, of course, I was trying to warn everybody about the housing bubble then as the former Assistant Secretary of Housing. I went back and realized, Russia's the second largest investor in the world in Fannie Mae. I wasn't dealing with a sovereign nation. I was dealing with basically the guys who own most of Fannie Mae's paper. So things behind the scene are never as they seem. They compete and cooperate. So these guys, Putin doesn't want to be run by corporations. He wants the Russians to run Russia. He doesn't want to be run by the corporate interests. And to a certain extent, anybody who keeps that model from getting global lockdown is protecting all of us from, because I assure you, once that global model is in a central box, if it ever gets into a perfectly central box, it's going to turn around and make life much more difficult for those of us who are in the developed world.
So back to the slow burn point. Do you see a slow burn basically as far out as the eye can see? Like, are we looking at what Japan kind of went through?
Here's what I think. The slow burn is going to continue for 2014. So in 2013, I said 75% chance of slow burn. The reason it wasn't higher was we still had a lot of fraudulent paper outstanding, which the Fed has now brought in and extinguished those criminal liabilities. Because as long as those criminal liabilities are outstanding, you can have too many factions fighting. So this year I said the chances of the slow burn is 80%, and here's why. You still have enormous problems and issues before us. One of you is familiar, being in Japan, you may be familiar with what's going on in Fukushima. If the cleanup at Fukushima is not successful, to me, that's a major wild card. The other thing is, if for some reason the deflation starts to accelerate, which it could, I think, we could easily see some significant wars break out. So to me, the risk is not one of global financial collapse, it's one of war or environmental catastrophe. So I think those are the things that could sabotage the slow burn. If you look at the controls in place, they're pretty strong, and so I think the slow burn has a pretty likely chance of continuing.
Well, so you brought up Fukushima and you brought up war, and I guess that is worth mentioning a little bit on Japan. I mean, first of all, I would say, what cleanup? I didn't know there was one. But
well, by that I meant the effort to move the rods off of the roof.
Yeah, but we get into the question of what's actually going on. What videos are we seeing? What's reality? There's really now a situation where no one will talk about anything about Fukushima who lives in Japan because of the laws.
Right.
And I'm not convinced. I mean, I think that was their weapons facility. I think it was a key area. It was in World War II for nuclear bombs, and I think that it is now, or it was until this accident. So a lot going on there that we can't be sure of. But in terms of cleanup, one thing they have done is cut down all the forests and grabbed up all the debris from that area, and they've burnt it on the days when the wind is blowing it to the U.S. And they've put it in the ones that don't have scrubbers, because the people at the top in Japan actually are not really good friends of the U.S. You know, the U.S., in my opinion, has been at war with Japan, or at least sabotaging them for 30 years or something.
Well, I would say it differently. I think the U.S. has been harvesting Japan ever since World War II.
Sure, but I think it's been more egregious, maybe the last 30 years, and
Right.
so I would not make the assumption that the current government in Japan is remotely friendly to the U.S. So that's another aspect of the whole question of war. And then I think there's the opening up of North Korea and Siberia there. Just as an example, it got no press in the English language papers, but Japan signed a bunch of deals and did a bunch of stuff with Russia, and involving the development up to the border with North Korea and all the pipelines there. And the next day, it's like the top admiral in Japan for the U.S. was removed with no explanation as to why. And
well, I would say strategically over the last 10 years
mm-hmm.
that one of the U.S.'s goals is to remain the hegemon in Asia, and
mm-hmm.
the biggest threat to that goal is Japan. Because
right.
not China. You know, everybody always talks about China. It's Japan, because Japan is really an engineering and economic juggernaut. I mean, it's extraordinary what the Japanese have accomplished. They are formidable. And they are so much further along, both economically and technologically, than the Chinese, that
mm-hmm.
I think the U.S. is afraid of Japan. And that always brings me back to what really did happen at Fukushima, and was it really an accident?
Well, maybe it's worth mentioning that I think it was around 2007 or so, but the biggest electricity generating nuclear plant on Earth was in Niigata, Japan. And two fairly large earthquakes happened 2 days in a row, and one of them was almost directly under that plant. It was about the epicenter was supposedly about 10 or 15 kilometers away. And it took it out. And there was a cover-up as to what happened, and it's in an isolated area that, it's not like Fukushima, which is not that far from Tokyo, and it's on the main
Right.
population bullet train zone. The one in Niigata was really way, way out of the way, and it was easy to cover it up. I mean, just fishermen and whatever in that area. And you do have to wonder, because that's when Japan started something that they hadn't done before, which is kind of a media control that before that, the papers and the TV would always show technical things. They love technical explanations of things, no matter what it was. And that was when they just stopped wanting to go into what seismographs look like.
Right.
And that raises questions, because they so love these kinds of technical explanations. I don't know. It's just a point to consider, but it was the biggest nuclear power plant from an energy point of view on Earth, and it got taken down, and it may well have leaked for all we know. So I think there has been this attack.
In the Indonesia, the time I kind of got sort of faced this was when the tsunami happened in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
I had been working with somebody who wanted to buy a World Bond Fund, and had helped them find a World Bond Fund that owned 15% of its paper in Indonesian sovereign debt. And they bought it, I don't know, I think early December 2004, right before the tsunami. So they bought it, say, I don't know, 2 weeks before the tsunami. And then a week before the tsunami, for no reason, it dropped in value by 15% overnight. For no reason, no explanation, no disclosure. We couldn't figure out anything. I mean, it made no sense. Massive insider trading. I couldn't figure out what was going on. It made absolutely no sense. And then a week later, the tsunami happened, and I realized, oh, they knew. They knew ahead of time, a week. And I said, it's funny because I'm a very optimistic, happy person. I literally had to just stop and think for about a week. How do you manage money in a world where people know a tsunami is coming a week beforehand and trade it? How do you
I guess you
manage
need to know
money in a world?
too.
Well, I then started watching the patterns financially of what was going on around some of these events, and came to the conclusion, too often that they are being traded, and that what we're watching is economic warfare with weather, and it's absolutely being financially, it's a financial and economic move when it happens, and great fortunes are being made on it. It's working. It's very, very financially profitable.
Well, yes, but it raises the question. I mean, it's one thing to do that to Haiti, but it's another to do it to Japan,
Right.
or even, for that matter, the fallout from Japan coming onto the U.S. and Canada. So there's some big issues there, and it's really hard to say. But going forward with the issue of 2014, what are some of the bigger highlights? I mean, I think that within the next couple of years, we may see North Korea come in from the cold and be developed, because there are tremendous natural resources there. And I think actually there's a big fight going on with Japan, America, Russia, and China, and North Korea and South Korea over developing North Korea. But that's just my speculation. Could be wrong. But I see the BRICS as trying to eliminate these zones of contention like Cuba, Iran, Burma, North Korea. I think a Russian and Chinese strategy is to make it so the U.S. essentially doesn't have a place to fight.
Well, I don't know. I think they're cross currents because everybody's sort of jockeying. But you see tension in all these different areas, and it's really, you see it at the BRICS. Are we using the financial system as a war zone and a weapon, or are we going to use it to impact, affect global trade? You're seeing this tension across the board, geopolitically, financially. One of the things that I'm hoping is that we've watched, for 50 years, we've had a long-term bull market in bonds, or certainly since 1980, so 33 years. Interest rates have been coming steadily down until this last year, and the possibility, particularly as an emerging middle class happens globally, can we shift the world's attention investment into equity? Because the reality is, if we finance globally with debt, we're going to have war. If we finance globally with equity, we have a reason to cooperate and have peace. And ultimately, I think we need to bring the financial system into alignment with any kind of system that's going to encourage cooperation and, economic health, particularly that recognizes the value of environmental health. Right now, we're all running around making money from doing things that are destructive, or too many of us are making money from too many things that are destructive. And so I think part of this is, can we align the systems? Now, to me, one of the most important phenomena that's happening right now, and certainly into 2014, is you now have 1.6 billion people globally on smartphones or tablets or desktops. So you've got 1.6 billion people connected through the internet, and it's growing at phenomenal rates. Since September 2011, I think it's grown at 500 million have been added. So this is very new, and it gives us the ability to be intelligent and cooperate in phenomenal new ways, which work around a lot of these very violent systems. So to me, that's one of the most exciting things that's happening.
Well, that's a huge change, of course. People don't realize how dramatic it is. If you haven't been out of, the the Western countries in a few years. For example, Mark Dancy was talking about the islands near where he usually lives in the Philippines, that they don't have electricity, but they do have cell phones. They
Right.
gather them up at night and take them in a boat somewhere to get them recharged.
Oh, how wonderful.
So think about that. Eventually they'll get electricity, but but before that they have cell phones. They have those right now. And
Wow.
of course, this is most interesting because that means, well, first of all, it means information, but it also means they can, shop or contact relatives for things. It offers the promise of lowering transaction costs dramatically.
Right. And
For
that's
people in
why,
that situation.
that if you look at what's happening in the financial system, not only are a lot of the different transactions moving onto that platform, but the payment systems are moving onto that platform, and the investment systems are moving onto that platform. And that's a real revolution in terms of who's who in the global economy. It's quite unbelievable. Have you seen the figure of how much, just guess, how much did the App Store at Apple make in December? What were the gross revenues selling apps at the App Store at Apple?
I have no idea, but the profit margins are going to be quite high.
It's $1 billion.
That was the figure that came to my mind, but
$1 billion in 1 month. And
Yeah.
they estimate that to date, developers making apps for the App Store at Apple have made $15 billion gross revenues.
I guess I would
pretty
be
much.
remiss if we didn't get if you want to comment on it. Any thoughts on Bitcoin? It's such a topic in the world. Now, I could mention Landtech and Okamoto, the NTT fellow at Kyoto University. We could mention some names that raise questions, but what are your general thoughts?
I'm not a fan of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And I confess I haven't studied it deeply.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, the notion that a digital currency is going to offer anonymity from the data beast, I believe, is ultimately phenomenally naive. And I also think it's a platform that, ultimately the guys who control the hardware are going to control. And so I've had a digital platform and had the Department of Justice come in and seize everything and use physical violence to affect their will. So, I'm a believer. I like a bank that has FDIC insurance, and I like a coin that I can put in my pocket and walk away, and government can't set or control the value of because it's in my pocket and it's recognized anywhere globally. It's tangible. So I'm deeply suspicious of Bitcoin. Now, I think that where the centralizers would like to go is to have digital currencies. It will give them ultimate control, and even marry it with gold. It would give them tremendous accountability. Once you've stolen all the money, you want a sound currency.
Right.
So I just think Bitcoin, if somebody wants to put money in Bitcoin, just make sure you don't put in any more than you're willing to lose 100% on, because there's a variety of risks in this thing, and always assume that whatever transactions you do with Bitcoin are going to be 100% transparent to the authorities. So don't buy Bitcoin and then proceed to do something that you think is an anonymous transaction. Maybe it'll be anonymous, maybe it won't, but you don't want to get surprised on that one.
Right. Well, I think the people who like Bitcoin would argue that there are like 3 or 4 killer apps, so to speak. And I can just say that, yes, it works 24/7, whereas wiring money doesn't. And the transaction costs are tremendously low compared to dealing with a bank. And the other thing is, if you've had much experience traveling around the world lately, you're likely to run into a bunch of situations where your Visa card or wired money or whatever just doesn't seem to behave properly. I was in a resort.
I
I was.
travel all over the world, and
Mhm,
I have a debit card from the tiniest community bank in America, and
mhm.
I have never had a problem getting money or doing transactions anywhere in the world ever.
But I've had several.
Really?
Yes, and I've observed people at the places. I wired money from Japan to a resort in Thailand, a big enough resort, and the transaction never went through. I'm in the office trying to deal with it, and there was a couple in Germany with the same problem. I have seen and known many, many people because most of the people I know are outside of the U.S. and a large percentage of them are Americans. And um, I don't know to what extent it's because somebody has a Bank of America card, or to what extent it's the amount of the money, or this, that, or the country in question. But I don't think you're going to have this problem going to Canada or Germany. But I think, if you go to Costa Rica or something, maybe it's more likely. I can't analyze it, but I'm just saying that uh, I can see a value in insurance, is all I'm trying to say. I don't trust the American banking system, and I believe the IMF is recommending capital controls nowadays.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we're in a world where you shouldn't trust any system completely. You should trust yourself, and that's why, I don't like depending on anything. If anything, I'm a squirrel. I believe in having little, pockets of nuts in 20 different places. But there are things I think that the American system is very good at, and other things about the American system I don't like as much. But the reality is, with the kind of breakdown in trust we have globally, there are real integrity issues all around the planet and between people. So I think you do have to be very careful. Now, one of the things I've always said is there's nothing more important than the quality of people that you do business with. And so, rather than just talk about particular systems, I do think that, when people said to me, I lost money on the MF Global situation, the American system isn't reliable, I thought, why in the world, if the former head of Goldman Sachs took over the business where you had a brokerage account, why would you leave your money there? You've got to be mad. We've all been spoiled into thinking that it's safe to leave our money in any institution if it's regulated and insured. We're not in that world anymore. We're kind of in a warlord planet where it matters the quality of people you do business with, and you're responsible.
Yeah, I'm here in the frozen tundra of Canada, Catherine, and I'm sure you're aware, but I think it was last year they just passed regulation that would basically lay the groundwork for bail-ins.
Right.
Do you foresee that like across the board in the United States, Canada?
I think we're going to have bail-ins. I don't know how much, and I don't know when. I'm surprised more haven't happened. But let me just describe what a bail-in is. I mean, if you're not going to have too big to fail, then you have to have bail-ins. I mean, a bail-in is just letting a bank fail. And it was pretty disturbing to me because when the Fed and the Bank of England sort of published their rules on how they were going to do bail-ins, there was enormous criticism throughout the internet saying, oh, this is terrible. Well, no, it's not terrible. If you think bailouts are terrible, then this is what you have to do. You have to let banks fail. And when you let banks fail, the depositors are going to lose money. That's how it works. So, and I, for one, would love to see us go back to a world where we individually had to take responsibility to make sure that we were putting money in institutions that behaved responsibly and were well managed. So I have no objection whatsoever to bail-ins. And I do think they're going to happen because you have enormous excess capacity in the financial system. So I don't see how we avoid it. Now, here's the question, the big question. We've laundered, $40 trillion out of the retirement systems and the governments of the developed world. And now we're sitting with an entire generation having been promised way more retirement benefits that there are assets to cover. And so you now have huge governments with enormous amounts of debt and enormous amounts of contingent liabilities, and the assets are gone. And so what the IMF is talking about is, well, wouldn't it be better to just face the music, make the adjustments quickly, and be done with it, sort of mark the thing to market? For many years I said, hey, let's just go get the money back, because if you got the $40 trillion back, there'd be enough money. But that situation has to be faced and dealt with, or we're going to continue to slow burn and grind through with friendly fascism being used to kind of keep the slow burn going, which is, I think the IMF is trying to just encourage a faster way.
Green Meadow, you had a question?
Yeah. So, Catherine, you've been talking a bit about equity systems versus debt-based systems. Can you go into a little more detail of what an equity system is?
Sure. So let's say you want to start a company, and I'm a venture capitalist, and you come to me and say, I want you to lend me money. And so I lend you $1 million to start your company. What I care about is that I get my $1 million back with interest. And as long as I get my money back, I really don't care whether you're successful or not. But if you come to me and say, look, I want you to invest $1 million and you'll be a part owner in the company. So let's say I own 20%, you own 80%. Well, then I'm going to do everything I can to succeed, because then my 20% is going to be worth a whole lot more. So I can get more than just my interest. I can get $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 million if I help you succeed. So I have a reason to want you to cooperate. And what we've been watching with the shift of what I call the rebalancing of the global economy, with the shift of money out of the developed world into the emerging markets, is we've been watching significant investment in equity investment throughout the planet. So during the East Asia crisis, for example, the UK and the United States picked up big equity positions in South Korea. And I think South Korea is a very strategic, is a country of great strategic importance to the United States and the developed world that's, sort of invested in them in 10 to 20 years. But the more we own equity in each other, the more we have reasons to want to cooperate. We're watching as the Chinese build up enormous dollars. They're now moving around the world and making big equity investments, particularly in the different resources or capacity they need to keep their economy going. And I think the more we own equity in each other, the more we have a reason to cooperate. So, for example, if everybody owns equity in Iraq, they're a lot less likely to drop bombs on it. What you've been seeing with many of the American actions is there's a place they don't own anything, they drop bombs. Then when they through dropping bombs, they own it all. Then they bring in government contracts that make the value of what they own go up. So part of what you're watching is a sort of battle to own the equity globally. But the more we can share equity investment in each other's economy, the more we have reason to want to cooperate. And to me, unless I see a real move going on globally, and it's happening at the regulatory level, to encourage a conversion to an equity model. So in America, whether directly or through pension funds, Americans have traditionally been equity investors. So about 40% of Americans directly or indirectly own equity in companies. In America, globally, that number is about 5%. It's very small. But with the emerging markets developing a broad middle class, if that middle class really becomes interested in being equity owners, you could really see a shift globally into global investment in each other, in the land, in the productive facilities, in the companies. And then you've got the basis for much more cooperation.
Catherine, I got a question. How does Islamic banking compare to what you're imagining?
Well, I like Islamic banking. In fact, I'm an investor in a REIT that has complies with Sharia. It's Sharia compliant.
Mm-hmm.
But Islamic banking is really, it's funny, it's banking, so in one sense it's fixed income, but it's much more in keeping with the principles of equity investment.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
And it clearly recognizes how destructive debt is. You know, I absolutely believe, I don't know if have you ever read The Art of War, Sun Tzu's book on...
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, when I read The Art of War several times, and I realized, the Chinese didn't have a bond market. So when they went about warfare, they had to be really efficient. Whereas, Europe developed a bond market, and that meant you could engage in massive wars before the taxpayers realized they were going to get stuck with the bill. And so, so in the West, we've gotten completely out of hand because we had the step model. And, of course, we're reaching the day of reckoning on the ultimate sort of explosion of the bond market and the debt market anyway. So to me, the question is, can we convert our investment out of the bond market and into the equity market, and in a model of cooperation start to grow the equity? And part of it is doing it in a way that brings financial equity investment into alignment with living things. So so that we design the financial system so you can make money from healing the environment and having places be wonderful and beautiful and not polluted, which I think is very feasible, but it's going to require a shift of much greater participation across the board in the equity markets.
Well, one question I have with this, though, is, I mean, it seems to me that a huge issue is the spread of technology. That, energy in Asia is not just that they're being left alone. It's that they now have the technological tools to get tremendous things done. Right. Kind of like the U.S., 120 years ago or 80 years ago or whatever. And so there's a technical side to this. And while, what can we say, the hidden rulers, whoever they may be, the guys with the motherships over Phoenix, right, may have the technology to go to the stars, is that as important as the fact that everybody in Asia is going to have cell phones and much cheaper energy and that kind of thing? There's kind of this other layer to the fight going on, in a sense, isn't there?
Well, I would say, do you know what I mean when I say morphogenic fields?
Yeah, of course, Rupert Sheldrake and all that. Mm-hmm.
Right. So what's happening with everybody plugging into the cell system is for the first time that we know of in the history of Earth, we're all connecting into one field.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Ventura is one of my favorite essayist writers, once talked about, I think he was writing about Los Angeles and how many people, having that many people in one place. And he was talking about the psychic storm and standing in the storm of our own being. And, with 1.6 billion people on cell phones, we now have 1.6 billion people standing in the storm of our own being. And I think that is a kind of out of control process. One of my favorite interviews with John Rappaport. John Rappaport has done an extraordinary series of interviews, but one was with a guy named Ellis Medavoy, and that was his pseudonym. He had done PR at a very high level for essentially a group of Mr. Global, and or the leadership of who were doing the centralizing. And at one point, Rappaport got very frustrated with him because he was talking about how easy it was to manipulate all of us humans. And John said, well, if we're so stupid and you guys are so smart, how come you're even talking to me? And Ellis said, every time we thought we had things totally controlled, this, intelligence would pop out, and the thing would be out of control and smarter than us. And he was kind of describing the divine intelligence. And it's what you see where markets are allowed to work. What you see is always miraculous because it turns out, the psychic storm together is always a little bit smarter than any one participant. And it's always quite miraculous to see. I did these billion-dollar mortgage sales during the 90s. My company was the lead distressed mortgage advisor. And, before we would put out the bid, I'd say, oh, well, I know what's going to happen and I know what the smart thing is to do, but we need to go through the competitive process. And then you put the thing out for bid, and then, oh my God, because we had the disclosure set up on Bloomberg and through the internet, so people globally could bid very easily. And what would come out of the psychic storm was just unexpected and miraculous, because the group intelligence was always just amazing. So I think that's why I think the spiritual consciousness is going to be so important. If the human morphogenic field can connect and that spiritual consciousness can kind of, take over, then things can transform in a much more evolutionary way, and in a way that will lead us to a vision which I think is a lot more hopeful for humanity. So, I'll never forget one of my magic moments on the Solari Report was we had William Tiller on, and I asked him, Tiller had been the head of material sciences at Stanford and had arranged private funding to do research on the impact of intention on material reality, and been able to prove that human intention could shift material reality. And I said to him at one point, what do you think of community prayer? And he said, oh, well, you have to be very careful, because if the people doing the praying are coherent, it can be very helpful. But if they're not, it can be harmful. And that's when I realized, what I need to do is just become more coherent. So.
Well, that's a good thought.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like we're in fascinating times here. Did you ever read Professor Quigley's book, The Evolution of Civilizations?
I've read one of his books.
Tragedy and Hope.
Yeah, Tragedy and Hope.
Yeah, because he was a very important figure, in terms of recruiting people, and President Clinton praised him a couple times in speeches and whatever. And
right.
I even know a guy who studied under Quigley and then later joined one of those groups and places where you never can return to the real world, I guess they say. And that book kind of points out that, it's not just a question of how the technology is in the hands of the bad guys at the top, right? It's also the question of what do the masses have. And so the fact that the people at the top may have cell phones that are 1,000 times better than what an Apple phone isn't really relevant. It's the fact that everybody in the Philippines is going to have the Apple phone that is relevant. And this is actually a positive message. He was arguing that the fact that the leaders of big countries have nuclear bombs, those bombs aren't very usable compared to the fact that everybody in the U.S. can go buy a 50 caliber weapon.
Right.
And I think we're looking at that in a civilizational stage right now. We're looking at it where if we can, like what you're talking about, if we can make an equity movement to where there's not profit in destroying people, there's profit in building things.
Right.
Then
There's
the fact that they have nuclear
things.
bombs won't matter.
Right, and there's also profit in building up human and living capital. There's alignment between, the expression that I've always used is the popsicle index. The popsicle index, when I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, for the first month, I had this unbelievably free-floating feeling of anxiety. And finally I realized it was because I'd spent a month being lobbied by people for what made their stocks go up, and they were unbelievably indifferent to what made the popsicle index go up. And let me explain what the popsicle index is. The popsicle index is the percent of people within a community who believe a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle alone, and come home alone safely. So when I was a little girl growing up in West Philadelphia, the popsicle index was 100%. It was unthinkable a child could roam free. And if you look at our economy for the last 50 years, the Dow Jones has been going up steadily, and the popsicle index has been going down steadily, and something's wrong with that picture. So, so we need to change the financial system so that you can align living. People and living things live in places, and places are financed with debt. And we've seen a world where corporations that harvest places and people can make money. And I think if we can change that so people can make money on places and people being successful, then you can start to get a world where the Dow Jones Index and the popsicle index have a win-win relationship. And then, of course, you're off to the races. And the capital gains potential is absolutely fantastic. I mean, that's the thing that's hard to understand is how, I have a little investment club called the Solari Circle, and one day I sat down and I said, okay, if we were free to optimize equity investment on planet Earth, how many more multiples could wealth be than it is today? And our vote was it was anywhere from 5 to 100 times. Wealth could be 5 to 100 times relatively quickly of what it is today. But that's a peace economy, and it's not necessarily going to be centrally controlled.
Yes. Well, on the other hand, though, I think there's a lot of good news, and we started this interview talking about looking back in 2013, and one thing that stands out is how can we phrase this? The pessimists are disappointed because not enough bad stuff happened, right? And they are right.
The economy is probably going to be reasonably strong relative to the last 5 years. So the pessimists are going to be pretty disappointed again this year.
Again, but you know what I'm trying to say. But what they are missing, though, is the fact that there's all this ability to make things 5 or 100 times better, and we only have to use a few of those to do it. Those people in the Philippines with their cell phones, that in and of itself is enough to improve their lives tremendously. And so I think we do have to keep this balance in mind. We can't just be pessimistic that, my old job doesn't have a long-term future anymore. We do have to think the world is moving forward in so many ways. But I tell you what, Catherine, I think your voice needs a break, and I think you've been generous with your time. So I think we can wrap it up here. Are there any last things? Your website is Solari.com, right?
Solari.com, and I publish the Solari Report. And my online book is Still Reading the Aristocracy of Stock Profits at UNWALKE.com.
Okay, that sounds good. We thank you so much again, and you've been providing a great service. I guess I'd wrap it up with saying one thing I personally like with your work is I think there's that quote from Thoreau about there are 1,000 people working on the branches of a tree for every one working on the roots. And I think you're the kind of person who's working on the roots, and I really do appreciate that. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you all for a wonderful discussion.
Okay, it's a wrap, folks.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so
Take
much,
care.
Catherine.